At the break of dawn, Ravenbridge stirred beneath a cloak of pale mist. Street lamps cast faint halos that wavered along crumbling sidewalks, revealing abandoned storefronts and chipped brick facades. Through the hush of the morning, the echo of distant footsteps hinted at the quiet desperation shared by many residents. Yet, in the far distance stood a stark contrast to this quiet struggle. The regal Sloane mansion, perched atop a gentle slope. Its grand silhouette dominated the horizon, illuminated by the first rays of sun. From these run-down streets, its towering spires seemed unreachable, a distant vision of wealth and influence. Magnolia Glass, an 18-year-old with a determined glimmer in her eyes, navigated these streets every day in search of odd jobs. Her figure was slender from missed meals, yet her posture remained upright, revealing a resilient spirit shaped by hardship. She had lost her parents in a tragic fire years earlier, leaving only faint memories of laughter and warmth. Ever since that day, she had taken sole responsibility for her younger brother, Rowan. Though still young herself, Magnolia bore a sense of urgency that belied her age, fueling her willingness to endure sleepless nights and grueling shifts if it meant ensuring Rowan's survival. Rowan, frail and prone to fevers, stayed indoors most of the time. A persistent ailment, worsened by the cold and damp environment of their modest apartment, had left him with little energy for normal childhood activities. When his coughing fits became severe, Magnolia's heart clenched with worry. She had been told by more than one doctor that advanced treatments could change his prospects, but such care existed beyond her limited means. Still, despite his weakness, Rowan's eyes held a sparkle of hope whenever he looked at his sister, trusting fully in her promise that better days lay ahead. Each morning, Magnolia rose before sunrise to scour the local bulletin boards for housekeeping or errand-running jobs. Occasionally, she cleared away rubble from half-renovated buildings, ignoring the ache in her muscles. It was on one such morning that she spotted an unfamiliar car rolling slowly through her neighborhood. Glossy and well-polished, it seemed out of place among the faded vehicles commonly found in Ravenbridge. The driver, a stern-faced individual in a tailored suit, handed her an envelope with the Sloane emblem pressed into the wax seal. It felt heavier than it appeared, stirring both curiosity and unease within her. Whispers of Evander Sloane's wealth had circled around town for years, but no one seemed to know him personally. Some claimed he inherited his empire from a long line of successful financiers, while others hinted at dealings that were less than honest. Either way, the Sloane estate on the hill was a symbol of power, a fortress where secrets might be kept under lock and key. Standing on a cracked sidewalk, Magnolia stared at the envelope's elegant script. Her heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. What could the infamous billionaire possibly want with a young woman like her? Later that day, as twilight draped the streets in cool, bluish hues, Magnolia found herself in a small cafe. Her mind churned with scenarios, some hopeful, others alarming. She considered the possibility of a job cleaning the vast mansion or maybe delivering packages to business partners. Yet she also recalled unsettling tales of the Sloane family's rumored involvement in unsavory ventures. Sipping her lukewarm tea, she felt Rowan's plight tug at her every thought. His escalating medical bills had already forced them into a tight corner. The chance to finally afford his treatment glowed like a distant beacon of salvation. Night fell swiftly, and Magnolia's modest living space offered little warmth. She tucked Rowan into a thin blanket, then sat beside the flickering lamp. Carefully opening the envelope, she read the letter. In formal language, it extended an invitation to serve as a personal aide at the Sloane mansion, an unusual position that included lodging and an attractive salary. Each sentence felt carefully crafted, granting just enough detail to intrigue her without revealing the full scope of her duties. By the end, she understood only one thing with certainty. This contract, if she accepted it, could be Rowan's only lifeline. At dawn, with the letter neatly folded in her bag, Magnolia stepped out into the dimly lit street once more. The city was still hushed, stirring only with the soft shuffle of early commuters. She glanced up at the distant mansion, half veiled in fog, as her heart pounded against her ribs. Fear of the unknown pulsed through her, but beneath that fear was a desperate hope. She drew in a shaky breath and clutched the employment agreement, her fingers trembling against the crisp parchment. In that pivotal moment, she resolved to walk forward, unsure if she was running toward rescue or ruin. Magnolia's breath caught in her throat as she stood before the towering iron gates of the Sloane estate. They were far taller and more elaborate than anything she had seen in Ravenbridge, each wrought iron curve twisting into a symbol she could not decipher. Beyond those gates stretched a long gravel driveway flanked by carefully trimmed hedges, all leading up to an opulent mansion built of pale stone. Morning light bounced off tall windows, reflecting a measured blend of stateliness and quiet foreboding. Here, the air felt different, crisp and cool, seemingly untouched by the decay prevalent in other parts of town. A uniformed guard, silent and stoic, motioned Magnolia forward. Inside the grounds, she noticed flower beds arranged in symmetrical patterns, each meticulously maintained to achieve a near-perfect display of color. The stillness unnerved her. No cars roared by, nor did any birds dare to chirp too loudly. Guided up a series of marble steps, she paused at massive double doors carved with intricate motifs. She wiped her palms against her worn skirt, inhaled slowly, and stepped over the threshold, unsure whether to be amazed or intimidated by the grandeur that lay within. The mansion's foyer introduced her to a world she had only imagined through whispered stories. Cool air stirred the scent of polished marble and fresh lilies, which stood in tall vases near the entrance. Ornate columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with a mural of skies and mythological figures. Everywhere Magnolia turned, she was met by the quiet regard of elegant portraits, former Sloanes in austere poses, their stern gazes seeming to follow her every move. At the end of the hall, a door remained locked and unmarked, as though deliberately set apart from the rest of the house. She made a mental note of its presence. A butler, whose tailored suit exuded professionalism, welcomed her with a courteous bow. "Miss Glass, the staff has been informed of your arrival," he said, voice low and measured. He introduced himself as Alastair, head steward of the estate. Without further delay, he offered a quick tour. He led Magnolia through corridors lined with refined furniture and artful sculptures that likely cost more than everything she and Rowan owned combined. As she trailed behind him, Magnolia's steps echoed, her discomfort amplified by the hush that enveloped the mansion. She sensed that few dared speak aloud in these corridors unless absolutely necessary. Before they finished the initial tour, Alastair paused at a well-lit gallery. Elaborate gilded frames displayed the Sloane ancestry. Sharp-featured men in formal attire, proud women draped in luxurious fabrics. Though their expressions varied slightly, some calmer than others, a unified gravity tied them together. One man's portrait stood out. Unsmiling, he bore an uncanny resemblance to Evander, hinting at the lineage's enduring features. Magnolia's attention, however, drifted to the edges of the canvas where an unfamiliar crest was subtly etched. Something about it tugged at her memory, but she could not quite place where she might have seen its likeness before. Along the way, she noticed occasional whispers among house staff. A young maid hastily avoided Magnolia's gaze. A kitchen hand offered only a guarded nod. She sensed that her sudden arrival bred quiet resentment. After all, she had come through an unorthodox hiring process. For them, she was an outsider who had somehow secured a privileged position. Their wary glances reminded her that every step she took here would be scrutinized. Yet she refused to back down. If being here meant Rowan could access better health care, she would endure any coldness these employees aimed her way. Alastair led her toward a small drawing room at the back of the mansion. There, she was surprised to see Rowan's coat hanging on a chair. She discovered that Evander had already arranged for her brother to be transported to a private clinic a short drive from the estate. The butler explained that a car had come earlier to pick Rowan up, and the young boy was now in the care of professional staff who specialized in his particular medical needs. Relief flooded Magnolia, though her mind bristled with questions. She had not been able to say goodbye, and she worried Rowan might feel abandoned or frightened. During this explanation, Alastair briefly mentioned a former employee named Gail Morrow. The butler's courteous tone faltered, suggesting lingering tension around the subject. Gale had been dismissed under circumstances Alastair did not fully clarify, but Magnolia gathered that his departure had left behind an undercurrent of unease. A discreet exchange between two passing maids confirmed her suspicions. They frowned at the name before hurrying on. Though she knew little, Magnolia felt that Gale's absence was more of an open wound than a closed chapter in the estate's history, one that could resurface at any moment. Soon after, Evander Sloane himself appeared, wearing a steeled expression that offered no hint of warmth. "You've arrived," he stated curtly. His voice resonated through the drawing room like a quiet warning. Dressed in a tailored suit, he carried an air of authority that left no room for pleasantries. In a measured tone, he instructed Magnolia on basic rules. She was to request permission before venturing into certain wings of the mansion. She would check in daily with Alastair regarding her tasks, and she was to maintain strict confidentiality about what she observed. His gaze flickered over her briefly, as if assessing whether she posed a risk. Magnolia struggled to keep her voice steady. "Thank you for arranging my brother's care," she managed, mindful of how reliant she was on Evander's resources. Her words hung in the space between them, echoing with a blend of gratitude and anxiety. Evander merely nodded, his manner as brisk as a business transaction. In that fleeting moment, however, Magnolia noticed a slight tightening in his jaw, a fleeting sign of inner tension or regret. Then it vanished, replaced once more by the practiced composure of someone used to exerting control. As she watched him leave, she couldn't help but recall her final glimpse of those locked doors and stern portraits, wondering just what secrets they were meant to guard. Here, among polished floors and silent corridors, she sensed a labyrinth of truths waiting to be uncovered. And in the distance, Rowan's uncertain future weighed heavily on her heart, urging her to stay vigilant for any clue that might save them both. Magnolia had barely settled into the hush of the drawing room when Evander summoned her with a brief nod. He led her into a smaller, private study she had yet to see, its walls lined with ledgers and elegantly bound books. A single table stood in the center, and on it rested a stack of papers she could only assume were legal documents. Although the morning light streamed through high windows, the atmosphere felt anything but warm. She took a seat at his indication, conscious of how stiffly she folded her hands in her lap, anticipating whatever formalities he intended to address. Her stomach twisted as she scanned the first page of the contract. Dense text outlined her responsibilities, many of which she had expected: general assistance, discretion regarding household affairs, unwavering compliance with Evander's directives. What made her fingers begin to tremble, however, was the restrictive clause buried in the middle. It stated she would be confined to certain sections of the mansion unless granted express permission to roam elsewhere. The words read like a warning. Her life, from now on, would operate at his behest. She looked up, alarm flickering in her eyes. Evander stood across from her, gaze unreadable. He clarified, in clipped tones, that this clause was necessary for security reasons, though he offered little detail. In exchange, her brother's medical expenses would be covered in full, no questions asked. Hearing the conditions spelled out so plainly made her pulse race. The thought of Rowan, dependent on advanced care she could never afford alone, weighed heavily on her conscience. A swirl of dread and hope churned in her mind, but she dared not show weakness. She steadied her breath, knowing this was the key to saving her brother's life. Her voice emerged in a near whisper as she asked why he demanded such a rigid contract. Evander avoided her eyes, glancing instead at the tall window behind her. "My affairs are complicated," he said, each syllable measured. "I expect complete adherence if we're to preserve confidentiality." Magnolia felt the weight of his words pressing in on her. She wanted to understand his motivation. Why choose her, of all people? But sensed she would gain nothing by prodding further now. Silence hung between them, and she fought the urge to look away first. Carefully, she lifted a pen from the table. Her hand shook as she signed the final page. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. Memories of Rowan's most recent coughing fit flashed in her mind, reminding her there was truly no alternative. She set the pen down with a trembling exhale, struggling to keep her voice steady. In that moment, the significance of what she had done stamped itself on her heart. She had traded her freedom for the faint promise of salvation. It felt like stepping off a ledge into the unknown. After she finished, Evander collected the papers, his jaw tight. He stood there, exuding an air of distance that bordered on regret. The corners of his mouth twitched as if he wanted to say something more, but instead he offered only a perfunctory nod. He then instructed her to follow any directives issued by Alistair, reinforcing the rules in the contract. The dismissal seemed abrupt, a clear signal that their exchange was over for now. Magnolia watched as he disappeared into the corridor, footsteps echoing across the marble floors. Though she had prepared herself for curiosity and perhaps a little unease from the mansion's staff, Magnolia was surprised by how swiftly suspicion cast its shadow. A housemaid who had once regarded her with mild curiosity now passed by without meeting her gaze. Others offered stony expressions, sending the message that Magnolia, this sudden addition to the household, was not to be trusted. It hurt more than she expected, but she couldn't let it deter her. She had made her choice, and the only way forward was to see it through. A few hours later, the local physician arrived with an update. He pulled Magnolia aside, expression grave, revealing that Rowan's condition had worsened. Her brother needed consistent oversight, potentially a specialized procedure the clinic could arrange if they secured the necessary funds. Magnolia's chest tightened at the news, her mind returning to the contract she had just signed. She might have sacrificed her personal freedom, but at least now there was hope for Rowan. The reminder of time running out only increased the pressure upon her. Each passing minute felt more precious than the last. Exhausted by the day's tension, she wandered the corridors after dusk. The hush of the mansion turned ominous at night, with only the faint hum of distant lights and the occasional whisper of servants finishing their tasks. Intent on finding a moment of quiet, she lingered by a set of ornate doors leading to the back gardens. That was when she heard Evander's voice through the partially open door of his office down the hall. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones, mentioning an outstanding debt and a promise that no one else must know. Unease rippled through her as she realized this secret arrangement might tie her fate to even darker dealings than she had first imagined. She edged closer, trying not to breathe too loudly, picking up fragments of a conversation that hinted at looming danger. Whoever was on the other end of that call demanded assurances, and Evander responded with clipped reassurances that the plan was under control. Magnolia's heart thundered. This uneasy alliance, whatever it was, could very well pull her deeper into the shadows of the Sloane estate. When Evander ended the call, she slipped away, unsettled by the tension in his voice and the urgency in his words. As she retired to her small room, she struggled to shake the feeling that her choice had bound her to something far more complicated and precarious than a mere employment contract. The thought lingered with her long into the night, leaving her uncertain of just how much she was willing to risk in the name of saving the person she loved most. Magnolia woke the following morning feeling as though the mansion's walls were closing in on her. She had barely slept, plagued by dreams of stern faces and locked doors. As she dressed, Alistair's distant voice drifted from the corridor, instructing the staff on daily tasks. She wondered if anyone else had heard the tension in Evander's late-night phone call, or if they would even dare mention it. Pulling herself together, she stepped outside her room, determined to confront the growing unease that gnawed at her resolve. At breakfast, she found the dining hall brimming with silent tension. Several staff members, long loyal to Evander's late father, kept their gazes firmly on their work as they set the table. One older maid, dark-haired with lines of disapproval etching her brow, placed a teacup before Magnolia without meeting her eyes. The faint clink of china rang out in the hush. Magnolia offered a polite thank you, but received only a curt nod in return. She tried not to let the chill in the air dishearten her, recalling that everything she did was for Rowan. If she could endure the stares a bit longer, her brother might finally receive the care he needed. When Evander appeared, he offered a clipped greeting and took his seat at the head of the table. His posture was as rigid as always, yet Magnolia noticed faint traces of fatigue beneath his eyes. She couldn't forget the phone call she had overheard, or how quickly his tone had shifted from cold to urgent. Their gazes briefly met, and he looked away. The message was clear. Whatever personal conflict he wrestled with, it remained his burden to bear, and he had little intention of sharing it. Halfway through the awkward meal, Alistair entered with an apologetic bow. "Sir, there is a visitor at the front gate inquiring after you. A man named Gale Morrow." Evander's expression darkened. "Turn him away," he said. Magnolia felt her heart skip. She remembered the name from whispered conversations, someone who knew too much about the Sloane family's dealings. The older maid who had served her tea earlier turned sharply at the mention of Gale's name, then resumed her duties with renewed hostility. Magnolia suspected the tension was tied to old loyalties that made her presence even less welcome. Once breakfast concluded, Magnolia retreated to the corridor, hoping to slip outside for a breath of fresh air. She almost made it to the front door before the same older maid intercepted her with a cloth in hand. "You're supposed to help with the dusting upstairs," the maid said tersely. Magnolia mustered a polite nod. "Of course. Which rooms?" "Start with Mr. Sloane's late father's study," came the reply, clipped and cold. "But mind you, Miss Glass, you do well not to meddle. Some things are better left alone." The implicit threat in those words sent a shiver through Magnolia. She realized that anything associated with the late Mr. Sloane held a certain reverence among the older staff. Her presence, a newcomer with questionable ties, likely felt like an intrusion on sacred ground. She climbed a winding staircase to reach a second-floor corridor adorned with somber portraits. At its end stood a study door bearing the Sloane crest. Slipping inside, she found a room steeped in the scent of worn leather and time. A heavy desk faced a broad window, while shelves of aged books lined the walls. Quietly, she began her assigned chore, wiping dust from shelves and tables, conscious of every creak beneath her feet. It was here, surrounded by musty tomes and faded photographs, that her mind began to churn with doubt. Her conscience pricked. She had accepted Evander's contract, which demanded nearly absolute obedience, yet the fragments she had gathered about his family hinted at shady affairs. She caught her own reflection in a tarnished mirror over the fireplace mantel. How much of herself was she willing to lose for Rowan's sake? She paused, cloth in hand, questioning whether she was already in too deep. The contract felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She thought of the phone call, of Gale Morrow's unexpected arrival, and of how every passing day uncovered another piece of a puzzle she feared to see completed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the door opening. Evander stepped in, face unreadable. "You've been assigned here?" he asked, glancing around as though the room itself were a painful reminder of something he couldn't quite voice. "Yes," she replied quietly, averting her gaze. "I was told to handle the dusting." He nodded. For a moment, it seemed he might say something else. Instead, he joined her at the window, gazing out at the manicured gardens below. "Gale won't take being turned away lightly," he murmured, almost more to himself than to her. She stole a brief look at his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "What does he want from you?" "That's my affair," he responded curtly, yet his tone faltered, as if he wrestled with the instinct to confide in someone, even someone he barely trusted. "He's trying to dig up old grievances." Silence lingered between them, the kind that vibrated with unspoken truths. Magnolia's heart pounded in her chest. She sensed that if Evander chose to reveal more, she might finally understand his role in this tangled web. But the barrier of his guarded nature remained, leaving her with only fragments and speculation. He glanced at her at last. "Focus on your duties, and keep your distance from Gale if you ever see him. He can be persistent." She nodded, words failing her. As he stepped away, she was left with a swirl of conflicting emotions. A growing empathy for this guarded man who bore secrets alone, clashing against the anger that flared whenever she remembered she'd handed over her freedom. Outside the study window, the gardens were calm and picturesque, yet Magnolia sensed the storm brooding within these walls might soon rage beyond anyone's control. Magnolia was polishing a glass cabinet in one of the lesser-used corridors when she overheard two maids whispering. One nudged the other, then quickly hushed her voice. "I heard his father left him more than just money," she said. "Something about a huge debt, maybe connected to unsavory dealings." The second maid bit her lip, wary of being overheard, and mumbled a cautionary reply. Magnolia pretended not to notice, but felt her chest tighten at the possibility that Evander's inheritance included more than simple fortune. She continued down the hall, passing portraits of various Sloane ancestors, each subject wearing a somber expression. At the far end, a housekeeper beckoned her over, glancing nervously to ensure no one else was near. "Miss Glass," she whispered, eyeing Magnolia with a mix of concern and curiosity. "I realize you're here under special circumstances. I thought you should see this." She gestured to a painting partially hidden by a vase of dying flowers. It depicted a stormy sky over a grand ship. In the lower left corner, a small crest was painted, almost invisible in the scene's dark tones. Magnolia recognized it in an instant, an angular pattern with a stylized initial in the center. She could still picture the same emblem from the night flames consumed her home, back when she was too young to fully comprehend the danger. Her throat went dry. She leaned closer, heart pounding against her ribs, carefully running a fingertip over the painted lines. It was no coincidence. The design matched her hazy memories. She had always believed her parents' demise might have involved powerful people. "Where else have you seen this?" she asked, voice trembling. The housekeeper hesitated, her gaze shifting down the corridor. "I can't be sure," she admitted in a subdued tone. "But rumor has it that crest belonged to a group connected to Mr. Sloane's father. Some say they financed certain deals, those that never saw the light of day." Magnolia swallowed hard, bracing herself against a sudden wave of dread. If the Sloane lineage came entangled with corrupt dealings, it might explain the secrecy surrounding Evander's affairs. Holding the housekeeper's gaze, she tried to steady her breath. Whatever secrets this mansion held, they reached far deeper than she had ever imagined, weaving her own tragic past into the labyrinth of the Sloane family's hidden legacy. Magnolia slipped into the mansion's library just after dusk, hoping for a moment of solitude among the tall shelves. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows over rows of leather-bound volumes. She paused when she spotted Evander seated at an antique desk, head bowed over a folded letter. He looked uncharacteristically unguarded, shoulders slumped and brows pinched in thought. She lingered at the threshold, unsure whether to intrude, until the soft rustle of her dress made him glance up. There was a flash of defensiveness in his eyes before he exhaled and nodded, allowing her to stay. She approached quietly, noticing the letter in his hands bore a delicate, swirling handwriting. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she murmured, voice cautious. Evander hesitated, then laid the paper aside. "My mother," he admitted, as if that alone explained everything. His tone was tight at first, but when Magnolia leaned in and offered a small, empathetic smile, he softened. They spoke hesitantly about childhood, how she used to chase fireflies in her old neighborhood, how he would sneak out of this very library late at night, imagining grand adventures. Though the confessions were brief, each one bridged the distance between them. She could sense a wistful longing behind his words. Eventually, Evander rose, as though remembering how to be a gracious host. "You look exhausted," he said, eyeing the faint circles beneath her eyes. "Perhaps a cup of tea?" He moved to a side table stocked with cups and a mismatched kettle, fumbling with the tea bags in a way that suggested he'd rarely done such a task himself. Magnolia couldn't suppress a small laugh when he spilled hot water over the rim. "I'm sorry," he muttered, irritation mingling with a sheepish grin. "I'm not used to, making tea." She reached over to steady his hand, guiding him gently. Their fingers brushed, and an unexpected warmth passed between them. It was a simple, clumsy moment, but it felt more real than any polite exchange they'd had. They settled back at the desk, each clutching a steaming cup. A comfortable silence stretched before them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fireplace. Though tension still lingered in the undercurrents, unanswered questions and unspoken fears, they shared a rare instance of fragile understanding. Magnolia caught his gaze for a heartbeat, and in that quiet second, she realized that beneath Evander's layers of stoicism lay a person she might genuinely care for. Magnolia found herself drifting through the halls at odd hours, keen eyes scanning the portraits and cabinets for any overlooked detail that might hint at her parents' fate. A lingering memory of the crest she had seen as a child kept gnawing at her, and she began to note which symbols appeared in documents or artwork around the estate. More than once, she caught herself studying Evander's behavior, a pause in his breathing whenever the topic of old debts arose, or the way he abruptly changed the subject if the conversation skirted too close to family history. She wondered if he truly remained ignorant of her past, or if he was simply hiding something behind his calm facade. One afternoon, she attempted to question Evander about an old ledger she found in his late father's study. It listed unfamiliar names and dates that piqued her curiosity. "I was organizing the shelves," she said carefully, "and came across some documents that might relate to older transactions." He stiffened, gaze sharp, and closed the book before she could continue. "That's none of your concern," he replied, a hint of warning creeping into his tone. "Stay focused on your duties." The gentle warmth from their recent moment in the library vanished, replaced by a controlled distance she had seen before. In parallel, Evander insisted on controlling every update regarding Rowan's condition. Each time the physician arrived to discuss treatment options, Evander made sure to be present, limiting Magnolia's ability to speak privately with the doctor. When she challenged his interference, he responded with measured firmness. "I'm covering the costs," he said evenly, "and I need to ensure everything proceeds correctly." A flicker of frustration crossed Magnolia's features. "Rowan is my brother," she countered, struggling to keep her composure. "I should be allowed to speak freely with his doctor." But Evander only repeated that confidentiality must be maintained for security reasons. Their uneasy alliance strained further under the weight of his controlling methods. Later that evening, Magnolia stood by a window overlooking the moonlit grounds, mulling over her choices. She knew she couldn't openly defy Evander, not without risking Rowan's treatment. Yet every new discovery, every locked drawer, every cryptic reference in those ledgers, pushed her to uncover the truth about the fire that had changed her life. Determined, she resolved to tread carefully. If she wanted answers without jeopardizing her brother's care, she would have to gather evidence quietly and avoid provoking Evander's ever-watchful eye. Magnolia stood in the dimly lit corridor, clutching a small scrap of paper bearing the crest she had meticulously copied from the painting. Her heart pounded as she weighed the risks of confronting Evander with her discovery. She could already imagine his guarded stare, the dismissive flick of his hand. A single misstep might cost Rowan access to the treatment he desperately needed. Yet if she kept silent, how would she ever uncover the truth about the night that stole her parents away? Late that evening, she found Evander in the study, engrossed in ledgers. She hovered at the door, wondering if now was the moment to speak. Before she could muster the courage, he looked up. "Magnolia," he said in a measured tone, "is there something you need?" She swallowed hard and shook her head, choosing for now to protect Rowan's care rather than demand answers. The shadow of disappointment lingered in her chest. Not long afterward, a faint knock sounded on her bedroom door. When she opened it, no one was there. Only a folded note slipped beneath the threshold. Inside, Gail Morrow's neat handwriting promised revelations about Evander Sloane's darkest secrets. Magnolia's pulse quickened as she realized a new path to answers might be closer than she ever imagined. Magnolia lingered in the estate's side garden, trying to make sense of the cryptic note from Gail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hedgerows, and as she turned to leave, she felt a presence behind her. Gail stepped out from behind a marble statue, his eyes scanning the path before settling on her. The intensity in his gaze set her nerves on edge. Before she could speak, he extended a worn folder, its edges frayed from time and handling. "You should see this," he said quietly, his voice laced with urgency. Reluctantly, she opened the folder. Inside were age documents, some referencing property deeds, others hinting at hidden investments. But what truly made her heart lurch were the references to a particular project, listed under coded names. Gail tapped his finger on one line. Evander's father was involved in a deal that went horribly wrong. There was a conflict over land development, corners were cut, bribes were paid. The fire that destroyed your home was a byproduct of that corruption. His expression hardened. Maybe he never intended to harm anyone directly, but once the blaze started, it was too late. and the family covered it up. Magnolia's blood ran cold as she traced the lines of scribbled notes, seeing her parents' last names scrawled amid the records. She felt anger rising in her chest, sharp as glass shards. The realization that Evander might have known, even if only in fragments, hit her like a blow. She recalled every guarded look, every half-answer he'd given. Her voice trembled. "Are you saying Evander was complicit?" Gale shrugged, but his eyes were grim. "I can't prove he knew, but his father's estate, the wealth he inherited, it's all tied to these deals. If he didn't know before, he knows now." Emotion surged through her, a chaotic blend of betrayal and fury. She thought of Evander's moments of warmth, the way he tried to brew her tea, the concern he showed for Rowan's treatment. Had it all been a performance to keep her from discovering the truth? She felt a bitter taste in her mouth, the sting of realizing her family's tragedy might be entangled with the very resources keeping Rowan alive. "Why are you showing me this?" she demanded, tears welling in her eyes. Gale's grip on the folder tightened. "Because you deserve to know what you're dealing with. No one else has the courage to tell you." With that, he slipped away as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Magnolia clutching the evidence against the fading light. She glanced toward the mansion, its imposing walls glowing in the sunset's last rays, and wondered whether she could ever look at Evander the same way again. Magnolia marched straight into Evander's study, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. He stood by the window, reviewing a set of ledgers, but she didn't wait for him to acknowledge her presence. Instead, she tossed the worn folder onto his desk. "I've seen enough to know your father's deals contributed to the fire that took my parents," she said, voice taut with anger. "Tell me you had nothing to do with this." Evander froze mid-page turn. Slowly, he set the ledger aside and lifted his gaze to meet hers. There was the barest flicker of alarm in his eyes. "Where did you get those?" he asked, ignoring the tremor in her tone. Magnolia refused to back down. "Does it matter? The point is, you already knew your family was tangled in something corrupt, didn't you?" He exhaled, a long, tense breath. "I suspected my father was involved in unethical ventures, yes. But that doesn't mean I ever approved of them or benefited from them in the way you think." His voice wavered, a crack in the facade of calm he usually wore. "Whatever deal he orchestrated, I didn't know about the details until it was far too late." Her outrage flared. "And you didn't see fit to tell me? Even after we spoke about my parents, after you insisted on controlling every detail of my brother's care?" The betrayal in her words made his jaw clench. "Do you realize how this looks? I'm trapped in your house, under contract, while my family's tragedy might be fueling your fortune." Evander's outward composure slipped, and for the first time, she saw genuine distress in his eyes. "I've been trying to clean up my father's messes since the day I inherited this place," he murmured. "I never imagined his wrongdoing led to something so terrible." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry, Magnolia. None of this feels right, but it isn't as simple as cutting ties. We're dealing with powerful interests, old contracts that can't be undone overnight." She stepped back, her chest heaving. "So you expect me to believe you're just a victim of circumstance?" Her words dripped with bitterness. In that moment, he looked more vulnerable than she had ever seen. "I don't expect you to believe anything," he said quietly, "but I swear to you, I never meant to hurt your family." A silence, thick with tension, settled between them. Magnolia's resolve trembled. She had grown to see slivers of compassion behind his aloof demeanor, but the magnitude of what she'd uncovered made it nearly impossible to trust him. She moved toward the door, and Evander made no move to stop her. Just before she stepped out, she cast him one last, wounded look. It was enough to unravel whatever remained of his composure. In the echo of her retreating footsteps, the study felt suddenly colder, the distance between them wider than it had ever been. The call came after midnight. Magnolia's heart lurched the moment the clinic nurse spoke Rowan's name in anxious tones, urging her to come at once. She bolted from her room, nearly colliding with a half-awake staff member in the corridor. In her panic, she didn't notice Evander following her until she reached the front door. He insisted on driving, eyes steeled with determination. She wanted to protest, but fear for Rowan swallowed any objections. They reached the clinic under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Nurses guided Magnolia into a small examination room, where Rowan lay pale and trembling, hooked to and fro. His breathing was labored, sweat beading across his forehead. Magnolia's chest constricted. She felt helpless, as though she were floating outside her own body. Evander stayed close, signing forms, speaking urgently to the medical staff, making calls to ensure every specialist was on hand. His usual reserve gave way to focused urgency. Hours passed in a haze of curtained hallways and muffled footsteps. Magnolia huddled in a waiting area, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. At intervals, Evander brought updates, some technical medical detail she barely understood. Along with hot tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. Exhaustion weighed on her limbs, but she refused to leave Rowan's side for more than a minute. Occasionally, she caught Evander rubbing the bridge of his nose, a telltale sign of stress she had learned to recognize. When a specialist finally exited Rowan's room, Magnolia rushed forward. He explained the situation. Rowan had endured a crisis and needed careful monitoring, but the swift intervention had likely prevented the worst outcome. Relief hit her like a wave, so overwhelming that her legs nearly gave out. Evander, standing just behind her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. In that moment, the anger and betrayal she felt toward him receded, replaced by the raw gratitude of having someone else share her burden. Once Rowan was stable enough for them to briefly visit, Magnolia stood by his bed, her brother's fragile form barely stirring. Evander stood on the other side, silent yet visibly shaken. His gaze reflected an unguarded tenderness she hadn't seen before. Her own eyes brimmed with tears, and before she realized it, they were drawn into an embrace. Hesitant at first, then more resolute. She felt the warmth of his jacket, her fingers trembling against the lapel. Evander's breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, she noticed the glaze of tears in his eyes. Neither spoke. Words seemed inadequate under the weight of this shared relief and fear. In that unspoken space, Magnolia sensed something shift between them, a fragile bridge forming over the canyon of distrust. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, they stood there for a long time, joined by relief, sorrow, and a glimmer of hope strong enough to hold them upright. Magnolia stood beside a flickering overhead light in the quiet clinic hallway, arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a late-night chill. The sound of distant monitors beeped behind closed doors, and she leaned her head against the wall, exhaustion lining her features. Evander approached slowly, stopping a few steps away. For a moment, neither spoke, each weighed down by the aftermath of Rowan's crisis. Finally, he cleared his throat and offered a hesitant smile. "He's resting," he said. "Doctor said his vitals are improving." She exhaled, relief evident on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, gaze flicking to the floor, "for everything tonight. I still don't know if I can fully trust you, but—" Her voice trailed off, emotions warring inside her. Evander shifted, clearly grappling with his own turmoil. "I understand," he murmured. "After all that's happened, I wouldn't expect forgiveness overnight. But he paused, releasing a shaky breath. "I can't stop thinking about you, about us. Every time I look at you, I remember the moment you almost collapsed with worry for Rowan, and all I wanted was to ease that pain somehow." Magnolia's eyes rose to meet his, something vulnerable shining there. "I can't deny the way I feel either," she admitted softly. "I've tried to pretend I'm only here for Rowan, but the truth is, I care about you in ways I never anticipated." A slight tremor ran through her voice as she confessed it, her heart thudding in her chest. Evander took a careful step closer. "I don't have answers for the past," he said gently, "but I want to find a way forward if you'll let me." She reached out, fingertips brushing the fabric of his sleeve. Her guard faltered, torn between lingering doubts and the solace of his presence. Silence settled between them, charged yet comforting. He placed a hand at her waist, drawing her nearer with the delicate caution of someone unsure if his touch would be welcome. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Under the sterile lights, they leaned in, sharing a soft, trembling kiss that lasted only a heartbeat. It carried a blend of hope and unspoken fear, the taste of tears and the warmth of a promise unspoken. When they parted, neither spoke for a moment, awed by the gravity of what had just transpired. At last, Magnolia let out a shaky laugh, her face tinged with color. Evander's lips curved into a tentative smile, and though worry still loomed large in the clinic's sterile corridors, for an instant, they allowed themselves to believe that perhaps tenderness could light their path forward. Magnolia stepped away from Rowan's room for a breath of air, only to overhear two hospital staff murmuring at the end of the corridor. One nurse shook her head solemnly. "I heard Gail Morrow's been seen meeting with some influential figures, people who've had their eyes on bringing down Sloan for years." Another nurse glanced nervously around. "If that's true, no wonder he's stirring up trouble for the family." Their voices dropped, but Magnolia caught enough to sense how precarious her situation had become. She slipped back into the waiting area, her heart pounding from the revelation. Gale had already proven he held dangerous knowledge. Now, if he was in league with those powerful forces, his aim might be more than just exposing past deals. He could be set on destroying Evander's entire legacy. A chill swept through her. She recalled the documents Gale had shown her, linking her parents' tragedy to the Sloan name. On one side was a chance at justice for her family, on the other a fragile, growing love for a man she wasn't sure she could fully trust. Evander appeared at her side, concern etched into his expression. He reached out, fingers grazing her arm as though sensing her unease. Magnolia offered a small, forced smile, every muscle in her body tensing with the weight of her divided loyalties. Could she continue down a path that might unravel the Sloan Empire, all while sharing late-night confessions and tender moments with its heir? She blinked, trying to steady herself. Whatever the future held, she stood on a razor's edge, torn between the promise of answers and the undeniable pull of her heart. Magnolia found herself back at the mansion after a tense night at the clinic, pacing near the main hall when raised voices drew her attention. She followed the echo until she reached a side office seldom used, the door slightly ajar. Inside stood Evander, his face rigid with anger. Opposite him stood Gale, clutching a slim folder in one hand, that familiar grim determination etched into his features. "I told you not to set foot here again," Evander hissed, his composure hanging by a thread. Gale snorted, flipping the folder open just enough for Evander to see its contents. "You think your father's skeletons are hidden safely away?" he retorted. "This is only a fraction of what I've got. Bank statements, land deeds, enough to bury the Sloan name." Magnolia swallowed hard, her heart thumping as she remembered the partial evidence Gale had shown her. Now, the threat was unmistakable. He planned to go public with the damning information unless he got whatever he demanded. She couldn't quite catch every word exchanged, but the tension in the air was palpable. Evander clenched his fists, stepping closer. "You're blackmailing me with worthless scraps," he said, though his voice shook. "I won't give you a cent." Gale's smirk was cold. "Then the world will know your family profited from a deal that sparked a certain tragedy." He paused, gaze flicking to the door as though sensing Magnolia's presence. "And that your father wasn't the only one who knew about it." A pained look flickered across Evander's face. Magnolia pressed her back against the wall, fighting a swirl of emotions. The fury that had simmered since learning of her parents' likely connection to Sloan corruption, and the pang of empathy she'd begun to feel for Evander. She hovered there, paralyzed. Gale was offering her a twisted kind of justice, yet her chest constricted at the thought of Evander's downfall, especially with Rowan's recovery still dependent on his support. As the argument inside the office escalated, Magnolia realized she stood at a crossroads. She could side with Gale, expose everything, and potentially avenge her parents. Or she could protect Evander, a man she was growing to care for despite his family's haunting legacy. The choice loomed as her footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor, her mind caught in the painful question of whom to believe, and whom she would ultimately betray. Magnolia found out about Evander's plan entirely by accident. While returning a stack of files to his study, she overheard him instructing a loyal staff member to prepare a bag of cash, an alarmingly large sum, more than she'd ever seen. The conversation dropped hints about a covert meeting at a dilapidated warehouse by the river. Her stomach turned to lead as she pieced together his intentions. He would lure Gale there, pay him off, and retrieve the incriminating documents. It was the sort of transaction that reeked of risk and desperation. Later, when Evander returned to the study, she confronted him. "You're going to meet Gale alone, aren't you?" she demanded, voice trembling. He didn't bother denying it. "I can't let him use our secrets against us any longer," he replied, stealing his expression. "If I can retrieve everything, I'll finally be free to handle this mess without losing everything my father built. Everything that now sustains Rowan's treatments and more." Magnolia's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She thought of the charred fragments of her past, the guilt that still hovered over Evander like a storm cloud. "I won't let you go there alone," she said quietly. "If you're handing over money for silence, I need to see the proof with my own eyes." He started to protest, but she wouldn't budge. "I have my reasons," she said, voice fierce. "Gale claims to have evidence about the fire that took my parents. I need to know what he's really got." Evander's jaw tightened, torn between protecting her and acknowledging her right to the truth. Reluctantly, he agreed, though his gaze held a flicker of apprehension. "Fine," he said, exhaling sharply. "But you'll follow my lead, and if things go south, you get out of there. Promise me." Magnolia nodded, though she doubted she could walk away if danger arose. The betrayal she felt still lurked beneath her carefully measured composure, but an unexpected thread of loyalty to Evander tugged at her, too. As she left the study, the gravity of her choice settled in. She would soon face the man who knew the darkest secrets of the Sloane family, and possibly the truth behind her parents' demise. Fear gripped her, but determination burned stronger. If confronting Gale at that warehouse was the only way to find answers, then she was ready to make whatever sacrifices the night demanded. Magnolia and Evander arrived at the deserted riverside warehouse just past midnight. The silence was haunting, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the docks. Gale stood in the shadows near a stack of rusted crates, his posture tense. "You brought her," he sneered, eyeing Magnolia. "Bold choice. Though I suppose she deserves to see the price you're willing to pay for your family's sins." Evander set the duffel bag of money on the concrete floor, voice tight. "You have the evidence?" Gale pulled out a folder, holding it just beyond reach. "Plenty more where this came from," he said, lips curving into a mirthless smile. Magnolia swallowed hard, stepping forward. "Show me," she demanded, recalling the documents that tied her parents' tragedy to the Sloane name. The flicker in Gale's eyes hinted at his true plan. Before they could move, he struck a match against a crate, igniting a line of accelerant that snaked across the floor. In an instant, flames surged high, illuminating the corroded walls and broken windows in a surreal orange glow. "No documents, no blackmail," Gale snarled, backing away. "I'll burn it all down if I have to." A wave of heat rolled toward Magnolia, and panic gripped her. Memories of another fire, her childhood home engulfed in relentless flames, battered her mind. She froze, breath stolen by the sudden dread that history was repeating itself. Smoke thickened the air, stinging her eyes. Evander grabbed her hand, alarm etched in every line of his face. "We have to go now." She felt the press of his grip, grounding her despite the horror unfolding around them. Sheets of flame roared upward, blocking their exit. Her vision blurred with tears, and a sharp cough tore through her lungs. Somewhere behind a swirling curtain of smoke, Gale's form vanished, leaving them trapped. Evander pulled her against him, trying to shield her from the encroaching heat. "Magnolia, stay with me," he urged, voice trembling with desperation. "Don't lose focus." She clung to him, fingers digging into his shirt. The concrete beneath their feet grew dangerously hot, and the acrid smell of burning chemicals threatened to suffocate them. In that moment, there was no question of old resentments or unspoken guilt. There was only raw terror and the unyielding need to survive. The flames crackled, casting dancing shadows across their faces, but Magnolia felt Evander's heart thundering against hers. As they stood on the brink of oblivion, fear and love collided with stunning force, forging a bond that neither fire nor betrayal could sever. Evander pulled Magnolia tighter against him, scanning the fiery chaos for any exit not yet consumed by flames. The building groaned ominously as molten beams overhead threatened to give way. Smoke seared their throats, and tears streamed down Magnolia's cheeks, a mixture of fear and the old terror resurrected by the blaze. In one desperate sweep, Evander spotted a narrow gap along the far wall, where the fire hadn't reached its fiercest pitch. "We can't stay here," he choked out, voice ragged. "Follow me. Don't let go of my hand." Clinging to him, Magnolia forced herself to stay upright despite her trembling legs. Embers rained down like cruel sparks. She stumbled, coughing, but Evander refused to release her. He half-supported her weight, forging a path through the swirling smoke. At times, the flames leapt dangerously close, singeing the hem of her dress and the sleeves of his jacket. Every footstep felt like an eternity, but he pressed forward, one arm shielding them from flickers of flame. Just as the ceiling started to collapse, they lunged through the gap, tumbling out into the cool night air. They tumbled onto the dirt outside, coughing and gasping in relief. Sirens pierced the night as emergency vehicles barreled down the abandoned road. A handful of Evander's loyal staff had arrived in the distance, having followed his directions to call for help when he failed to check in. Gale, attempting to flee through a side entrance, was intercepted by authorities. Two uniformed officers wrestled him to the ground, tearing the incriminating documents from his grasp. Shouts and chaos ensued. But in that moment, Magnolia could only focus on breathing, her lungs burning as if they were still on fire. Evander cradled her face between his soot-stained hands, relief mingling with obvious concern. "You're safe," he murmured, voice quivering with exhaustion. She reached up, brushing ash from his hair, feeling the erratic pound of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. Despite the inferno they had just escaped, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames coursed between them. Sirens wailed, and the swirling lights of emergency vehicles illuminated their charred clothes. Yet all Magnolia could see was Evander's raw determination and the fierce tenderness in his eyes. For the first time, no secrets or doubts clouded her view. They had survived, bound closer by both terror and love, and she realized that this bond felt stronger than any devastation the night could bring. The day after the warehouse inferno, a whirlwind of official activity descended upon Ravenbridge. Police cars and unmarked vehicles lined the mansion's driveway, their occupants combing through newly unearthed documents seized from Gale. With Gale in custody and the evidence in hand, investigators began mapping out the tangled web of corruption that had once powered the Sloane Empire. Names of high-ranking officials, bankers, and investors surfaced, each threaded into deals that Evander's father had orchestrated long ago. Evander stood near the entrance, observing the bustle with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Soot still clung to the collar of his shirt, and exhaustion weighed on his shoulders. Yet for the first time, he could see a path toward vindication. As an officer passed by with a stack of ledgers, Evander couldn't help asking, "How bad is it?" The officer glanced up, sympathy in his eyes. "Your father signed off on a lot of questionable ventures," he replied, lowering his voice. "But from what we're seeing, you were kept out of most of it." The blame points in another direction. Magnolia appeared at his side, offering a supportive touch to his arm. She had been cooperating with authorities too, recounting what she knew without omitting the painful parts about her parents. Word traveled quickly that the tragedy leading to her family's loss had roots in a series of under-the-table land contracts and safety compromises. Though Evander's own role seemed minimal, the taint on his family name still hovered like a ghost. "At least they know it wasn't your doing," she said softly, catching the worry in his gaze. Attorneys soon arrived, armed with binders and laptops, discussing the legal ramifications of dismantling a network that spanned county lines. Magnolia overheard snippets of conversations about court dates and depositions. Some of the blame would undoubtedly settle on the late Mr. Sloane's estate, but the prevailing consensus among the investigators was clear. Evander might have inherited the aftermath, but he hadn't created it. In the mansion's foyer, the weight of collective tension began to lift. Even the house staff, who had once eyed Magnolia with suspicion, seemed cautiously hopeful that their employer was on the path to clearing his name. Standing in the open doorway, Evander glanced toward the horizon, where the sun cast a pale light over Ravenbridge. It felt symbolic of a new beginning, one where truth and accountability might finally replace secrecy and fear. And by his side, Magnolia inhaled deeply, sensing that their precarious union had shifted onto firmer ground. Rowan's room at the clinic was awash with soft morning light when Magnolia and Evander arrived to check on him. The doctor greeted them with a rare, warm smile. His latest tests look promising, he announced. He's responding extremely well to the specialized therapy. Magnolia's heart soared at the sight of her brother sitting up, color returning to his once pale cheeks. Rowan beamed, waving them over, and Magnolia rushed forward, hugging him with a gentle care. Evander lingered by the door, relief written plainly on his face. In the days that followed, Rowan's condition improved steadily, each step toward recovery mirroring the hopeful new chapter unfolding back at the mansion. Having narrowly escaped the suspicions and hostility of certain staff members, Magnolia noticed a subtle shift in their attitudes. The older maid who once refused to meet her eyes now offered a quiet smile when they passed in the corridor. A footman, who had harbored doubts about Magnolia's influence on Evander, awkwardly thanked her for pulling Evander to safety during the warehouse fire. Though formalities remained, a sense of mutual respect had begun to replace the cold wariness that once prevailed. Amid these changes, Evander uncovered more about his mother's departure. While sorting through personal letters in his late father's study, he found notes hinting that his mother had fled the estate to shield him from the very corruption now being dismantled. According to these documents, she realized how deep his father's criminal ties ran and believed that leaving was the only way to keep her son free from a legacy of wrongdoing. Evander read each page in silence, emotion flickering behind his usually composed gaze. Later that evening, he confided in Magnolia. "She was trying to protect me," he said quietly, running a hand over the faded letters. "All this time, I thought she'd abandoned us. But she didn't want me caught in his web." His voice held a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Magnolia gently rested her hand on his arm, offering wordless comfort. In that moment, neither of them could deny how the veil of secrecy had started to lift, replaced by revelations that, painful as they were, opened a path to genuine healing. As Rowan continued to regain his strength, the mansion itself hummed with renewed purpose, a testament to the possibility of forging something honest and bright from the ashes of the past. Magnolia stood at the edge of the mansion's garden, watching the afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the neatly trimmed hedges. It felt strange to remember how desperate she'd been when she first arrived. A powerless young woman willing to sign away her freedom to keep her brother alive. Yet now, she breathed in the scent of blooming roses and felt not fear, but a quiet sense of possibility. The estate was far from perfect, haunted by a history of deception, but she no longer felt trapped by the shadows of her past. She wandered to a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, lost in thought. If someone had told her months ago that she would stand on equal footing with Evander Sloane, she wouldn't have believed them. But the fires she survived, both literal and figurative, had tempered her resolve. Every confrontation, every risk taken for Rowan, had forged in her a core of steel she never knew she possessed. She placed a hand over her heart, remembering the moment in the clinic hallway when she chose to embrace her budding feelings rather than bury them under suspicion. Evander approached, wearing a subdued expression that hinted at the heaviness of recent revelations. Without speaking, he sat beside her, gaze drifting across the manicured lawns. "I used to think power meant money," he said at last, voice rough with lingering emotion. "But none of that could stop the chaos my father left behind, or mend the hurt he caused. It didn't heal your pain, and it couldn't ease my guilt." Magnolia turned to meet his eyes, sensing the genuine regret and humility behind his words. "I've seen how much good you can do when you're thinking of others, not just the estate," she said, her hand brushing his. "Everything you've done for Rowan proves you've got more empathy than you realize." They shared a short, quiet laugh, more relief than amusement, aware of the road still ahead. The corrupt network still needed dismantling, and old wounds wouldn't magically heal overnight. Yet the two of them had found something stronger than fear or anger, a shared commitment to rebuilding what had been broken. Standing together, Magnolia felt the last vestiges of her old desperation fade, replaced by a renewed purpose. With Evander's arms circling gently around her shoulders, she let herself believe that they could nurture a future unburdened by secrets, guided by the power of understanding and the love that bound them in spite of everything. Morning light spread across the mansion's garden, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Magnolia walked beside Evander along a winding gravel path, the dew-kissed flowers nodding gently in the cool breeze. The past few weeks had been a maelstrom of confrontations, revelations, and moments of unexpected tenderness. Yet somehow, they had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. She glanced at Evander, who paused near a sprawling old tree, its branches reaching toward the horizon like open arms. He turned to face her, sunlight glinting in his eyes. "I used to believe the estate was just a symbol of my father's legacy," he said quietly, "but now I see it can be something else, something better." Magnolia studied him for a moment, noting the flicker of vulnerability behind his calm exterior. "It can be a place that reflects who we want to be," she replied, giving a small, genuine smile. No more secrets, no more fear. A gentle hush settled between them as they listened to birds sing from distant treetops. Evander lifted his gaze to the manor's stately windows. "There's a lot of work ahead," he murmured, voice touched with a hopeful tremor. "Walls to repair, debts to settle. But at least we'll be honest this time." Magnolia brushed her hand across his arm, as if reassuring him. "We've already faced the worst. Anything we do now is a choice toward rebuilding, not just the estate, but our lives." She paused, recalling all that had transpired. Her parents' tragedy, Rowan's battle for health, and the fire that almost claimed them both. Each memory ached, yet also reminded her of how far they'd come. Evander reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I promise you," he said softly, "I won't run from the truth anymore." Her heart swelled at the sincerity in his tone. "And I'll stand with you," she answered, voice steady. "Together, we can create something good here." They turned toward the rising sun, bathing in the gentle rays that spilled across the horizon. Magnolia's hand rested lightly atop Evander's, the two of them linked in a quiet bond. The world still held challenges, lingering legal proceedings, cautious staff, and personal wounds needing time to heal. Yet as they stood amid the blossoming garden, dawn breaking over Ravenbridge, they felt a surge of hope. It was a promise of renewal, a testament to the power of truth and compassion, and a gentle reminder that even the darkest shadows could give way to light.